Greetings, dear friends, and welcome back. We are so delighted you've chosen to spend another quiet evening with us here at Bedtime Biographies, where history's most fascinating figures gently guide us toward rest, reflection, and dreams of worlds long gone. Tonight, we turn our attention to a man whose ideas reach deeper into the human mind than perhaps any thinker before him. A man who believed that hidden beneath our calm, civilized exteriors lies an entire universe. Dark, conflicted, full of desires we dare not speak aloud. His insights unsettled the world, outraged polite society, and reshaped modern thought so completely that we now use his terms without even realizing it. This is the story of Sigmund Freud, the man who dared to ask, what if the greatest mysteries of human behavior lie not in the stars above, but in the shadows within? Before we begin, if these calm journeys through the past help you unwind at the end of your day, we would be truly grateful if you take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. It helps others discover these soothing stories, and we love hearing your thoughts, reflections, and ideas for future biographies. And now, let us drift together into the candlelit corridors of 19th century Vienna, into a world of velvet curtains, gas lamps, and unspoken secrets. Part 1, The Child of Hidden Worlds, 1856-1873. Our story begins not in Vienna, as one might expect, but in a small market town nestled deep within the Austrian Empire. Freiburg, in Moravia, today part of the Czech Republic. It was May 6th, 1856, when a child was born into a modest Jewish family in a quiet house with creaking floors and low ceilings, where the flickering warmth of oil lamps softened the long nights of the old world. His name was Sigmund Shlomo Freud, though the world would one day know him simply as Sigmund, a name forever linked with the hidden recesses of the human mind. Freud's father, Jakob, was a wool merchant, stern yet affectionate, a man shaped by Old Testament stories and the hard lessons of business in a Europe that never fully welcomed Jews. His mother, Amalia, was nearly 20 years younger than her husband, lively, intelligent, and fiercely proud of her firstborn son. Freud later recalled that he was her darling, designated from infancy as something special. "My golden Siggy," she called him, holding him close as though she already sensed that destiny had placed a heavy question mark on his small shoulders. The atmosphere of his childhood home hummed with contradictions, warmth and fear, ambition and insecurity, hope and displacement. Jews living under the Habsburg crown survived through constant vigilance. In public, they played their roles, but at home they whispered stories of ancient worlds, of exile and return, of hidden truths carried from generation to generation. Freud absorbed these tensions like a sponge. Even before he could read, he sensed that what was publicly spoken was not the whole story. When Freud was just 3 years old, his family packed up their belongings and fled Freiburg. Economic hardship and the search for better opportunities pulled them toward the cultural heart of the empire, Vienna. The city that awaited him was a sprawling labyrinth of imperial ambition and bourgeois anxiety, a place where glittering opera halls stood beside poverty-stricken alleyways, where social norms were immaculate on the surface, but riddled with hypocrisy beneath. Vienna, in the mid-19th century, was a civilization dressed in lace and manners, terrified of its own impulses. In other words, it was the perfect incubator for Sigmund Freud. Freud was an unusually observant child. He noticed expressions, gestures, tensions beneath smiles. He sensed when adults lied and wondered why they did so. He saw desire flicker behind propriety like fire behind stained glass. He read voraciously, driven less by curiosity about facts than by fascination with motives. Why did people feel shame? Why did they hide their thoughts? Why were some ideas whispered and others celebrated? His family encouraged his intellect, though resources were scarce. They lived in cramped quarters with Freud's many siblings and half-brothers, but one crucial fact set him apart. Sigmund was given his own room. It was a rare privilege, a small universe of quiet in a home bursting with noise. Freud would spend hours alone with books and ideas, cultivating a rich inner world where thoughts and instincts bumped into one another, demanding explanation. Even as a boy, he felt the pull of greatness. Not arrogance exactly, but an intuition that his mind was a vessel for something waiting to be discovered. He once wrote that he carried inside him a kind of inner certainty, as though he were not merely living out a childhood, but preparing for a mission he could not yet articulate. In school, he excelled quickly, mastering languages with astonishing ease. He read Shakespeare, Goethe, and Sophocles, not merely as stories, but as case studies of human desire and self-destruction. His teachers recognized his brilliance, but brilliance alone did not make him unusual. It was his relentless attention to the emotional undercurrents of life, his awareness that people said one thing but felt another, that marked him as different. Freud also experienced the sting of anti-Semitism early. He saw classmates dismissed as other, felt the weight of being tolerated rather than accepted, learned the silent rules of survival. Blend in, excel. Do not draw the wrong kind of notice. Such pressures do not disappear. They burrow inward. Freud would spend his life exploring what society forces the individual to repress, because he knew repression from the inside. His father Jacob played a defining role in this psychological formation. A memory Freud later recounted tells the story vividly. One day, Jacob was walking with young Sigmund when a Christian man knocked his hat into the mud, sneering, "Jew, off the pavement!" Jacob did nothing. He picked up his hat, brushed it off, and walked away. To a child, this was disorienting. Heroes fought back. Why hadn't his father? Years later, Freud compared this moment to a story of ancient Jewish pride, one in which his ancestors stood strong against oppression. The contrast haunted him. The child wondered, what happens to a man who swallows humiliation? Where does that anger go? Does it rot? Does it transform? Does it hide? These are not ordinary childhood questions. They are the seeds of psychoanalysis. By the time Freud entered the gymnasium, the elite secondary school, he was already oriented toward the interior landscape of human beings. He excelled in languages, devoured science, and trained his memory with meticulous precision. Teachers praised his discipline. Classmates found him either impressive or unsettling. He rarely played sports, preferring to sit quietly, imagining the invisible forces shaping the world. Vienna itself was transforming. Railways expanded. Factories belched smoke into the air. Cafes buzzed with writers and thinkers debating philosophy, politics, and sex, though the latter always encoded language. Freud grew up in a city where intellectual ambition coexisted with intense social repression. People bought pastries at the bakery while dreaming of forbidden pleasures they dared not confess. In this tension, Freud began to perceive a truth that would define his life's work. Human beings are not rational creatures who sometimes feel irrational impulses. Rather, we are emotional beings who have learned to pretend that reason is in control. Freud's early years were filled with sensations, impressions, and unanswered questions that would one day form the foundation of psychoanalysis. He became fascinated with biology, then neurology, believing that the secrets of the human mind might be found in the body itself. Yet, even in those youthful scientific pursuits, he sensed something science had not yet dared to touch: the emotional forces that move us: love, loss, jealousy, fear, dreams, desire. He watched adults contradict themselves. He heard laughter that disguised bitterness, arguments that concealed longing, silence charged with meaning. He learned that what people declare is rarely what they believe, and what they believe is rarely what they feel. The real person, he realized, lives beneath these layers, in the hidden chambers of the mind. By the time he graduated, Freud was not merely an excellent student. He was a young man obsessed with the invisible. He wanted to peel back the layers of consciousness like wallpaper hiding secret messages beneath. He wanted to understand why people dream, why they lie, why they suffer, why forbidden thoughts sneak into polite minds at inconvenient moments. He wanted to know not simply what people do, but why they do it. Vienna, with all its constraints and splendours, had prepared him perfectly. It had shown him a world that worshipped reason while tremoring beneath it. It had shown him that desire does not vanish simply because society demands its silence. And it had shown him that the greatest mysteries are not found in exotic lands or ancient texts, but in the human heart beating quietly inside every chest. As young Sigmund Freud stepped toward adulthood, he carried with him three things that would shape the world to come: an unyielding curiosity, a belief that every human action has a hidden motive, and a determination to uncover truths others were too afraid to see. The child had grown, the mind had sharpened, the curtain had lifted, the century of the unconscious was about to begin. Part 2. The Making of a Doctor of the Mind, 1873-1886. In the autumn of 1873, at the age of 17, Sigmund Freud walked beneath the towering stone arches of the University of Vienna for the first time. He was slender, dark-haired, and sharply observant, his eyes already shaped by the quiet intensity that would one day unnerve and fascinate the world. Vienna's university, one of Europe's grand intellectual fortresses, echoed with the footsteps of young men who dreamed of shaping the future. Freud was among them, but his dreams reached deeper than the empire's ambitions. He did not want to conquer cities, but the invisible realms that lay behind the human face. Vienna was expanding rapidly, its boulevards lined with cafes filled with smoke and ideas. Students debated Darwin, Marx, and Nietzsche while sipping coffee that grew cold between arguments. Science, once bound tightly to tradition, was beginning to pry open the machinery of nature. New instruments revealed cells, nerves, and invisible organisms that rewrote the old stories. A quiet revolution was underway, one that Freud entered like a diver, stepping into uncharted waters. He enrolled first in law, as was respectable and expected for a young man of promise. But law held no allure for him. Rules were surface-level constructs, interpretations of behaviour, not explanations of it. His heart tugged him elsewhere, to physiology, biology, and later the enigmatic workings of the mind. His restless curiosity found no nourishment in the courtroom's logic. Within a year, he transferred to the medical faculty, not because he felt called to heal the body, but because medicine, at that time, was the only doorway through which one could legitimately investigate the mysteries of human nature. His days were consumed by study. While other students laughed in the hallways or courted admirers along the Danube, Freud spent solitary hours in libraries, hunched over texts written in dense German, Latin, or Greek. He read Virchow and Helmholtz, whose works sought to unite biology and physics into one coherent picture of the organism. he read Darwin, whose audacious theory of evolution shook the foundations of Western certainty. Freud absorbed these ideas as if they were oxygen, his mind racing to discover the hidden principles that governed human life. He often felt something stirring beneath the words he studied, a silent whisper that science had not yet learned to hear. Anatomy explained the structure of the body, physiology its functions, neurology its wiring. But Freud sensed another layer beneath, the unseen forces driving human behaviour, forces no lecture yet dared to name. His professors, brilliant though they were, attended to measurable phenomena: blood flow, muscle fibres, reflex arcs. Freud mastered these, but his attention drifted toward the faint tremors of desire and the fear lurking behind them. What caused someone to blush? Why did memories linger like ghosts? What compelled a thought to return unbidden, unwanted, yet irresistible? These questions hovered at the edge of contemporary science, and Freud followed them with the devotion of a pilgrim seeking a sacred site. The one place where Freud's fascination found both guidance and friction was in the laboratory of Ernst Wilhelm von Brücke. Brücke was a titan of the new scientific age, a physiologist who believed that every function of the human body could be explained by physical laws. Nothing mystical, nothing spiritual, only matter obeying forces. For Brücke, the soul was not a mystery, but a mistaken metaphor. Freud, eager to please but more eager to understand, absorbed Brücke's rigour with disciplined enthusiasm. Under Brücke's mentorship, he learned experimental precision, the sacred duty of observation, and the humility required to follow facts even where they led against one's preferences. Freud admired him deeply, yet something inside Freud resisted Brücke's strict materialism. Brücke saw the body as a machine, but Freud sensed a ghost in the machine. He could not shake the feeling that science had amputated something essential: the richness of inner experience, the tremors of feeling, the labyrinthine corridors of memory. The laboratory revealed mechanisms, but it could not explain the strange drama unfolding behind every human gaze. Still, Freud worked tirelessly, and his diligence earned recognition. He dissected eels to search for reproductive glands, slicing through tissue for hours, seeking something that eluded even seasoned biologists. The task was tedious, the rooms stank, and progress came in millimetres rather than leaps. But Freud endured. The mind that would one day unlock dreams was forged in the patience of scalpels and microscopes. He published early research papers on animal neurology, modest studies by future standards, but enough to place him on the track of scientific legitimacy. The quiet Moravian boy had become a serious man with a reputation for brilliance. Yet there was a cost. Freud lived with poverty pressing at his door. His family could not subsidize his studies indefinitely, and he often skipped meals to save money. But hunger sharpened him. He became ruthless with distractions, uninterested in frivolities. Even love seemed, at this stage, an indulgence he could not afford. But love, as he would later insist to the world, is never rational. In 1882, Freud met Martha Bernays, a vibrant and intelligent young woman from a respected Jewish family. Her laughter softened him. Her presence disrupted his monastic resolve. He fell in love quickly, intensely, and with the kind of fervour only a mind accustomed to solitude can feel. Freud desired a future with her, but marriage demanded stability, stability demanded income, income demanded career, and career demanded breakthroughs. Martha became the quiet flame that fueled Freud's ambition. He wrote her letters overflowing with longing, plans, worries, and an obsessive sense of destiny. "Only love keeps me going," he confessed, and he meant it. but love was also pressure. It reminded him that brilliance without bread was merely a burden. To secure his future, and hers, Freud made a decisive shift. He left Bruker's laboratory and pursued clinical medicine, moving toward neurology under Theodor Meinert, Vienna's foremost brain anatomist. Meinert was brilliant yet volatile, a man who viewed the mind through the architecture of the brain, convinced that mental disorders were disruptions of neural pathways, not struggles of the soul. Freud admired Meinert's knowledge, but sensed another absence, the emotional dimension. Meinert mapped the brain with precision, but where was fear? Where was longing? Where was anguish, guilt, memory? Where, in all those cortical folds, did secrets live? Freud's questions remained unanswered. Then came the journey that changed everything. In 1885, Freud received a grant to study in Paris under the legendary Jean-Martin Charcot, a neurologist whose lectures drew audiences like performances. Charcot was not merely a scientist, he was a conjurer of minds, commanding patients into trances through hypnosis, unveiling symptoms that defied anatomy. Freud watched astonished as Charcot treated hysteria, a condition thought to afflict only excitable women, as a genuine disorder of the nervous system. Vienna called such patients liars. Charcot called them sufferers. The room trembled with implication. Freud sat transfixed as Charcot demonstrated that the mind could produce physical symptoms. Blindness without injury, paralysis without damage. Illness, Freud realized, was not merely of the body. It could emerge from ideas, memories, desires, forces no microscope could detect. Here lay the spark. Freud returned to Vienna transformed. He knew he would never again be satisfied with explanations that ignored the invisible. He married Martha, as promised, and began his medical practice. But beneath the routine treatments, a secret ambition bloomed. He wanted to uncover the laws of the mind the way Newton uncovered the laws of motion. His peers dismissed Charcot's work as spectacle. Freud, however, felt he had glimpsed the future. He began experimenting with hypnosis, probing memories, encouraging patients to speak freely, a radical act in a culture where silence protected reputations and fates. Gradually, he sensed something extraordinary. When patients spoke without censorship, their symptoms shifted. Words unlocked pain the body held hostage. Hidden memories surfaced like corpses from a frozen lake. And Freud realized that the mind was not merely conscious thought. It was a layered terrain. A house with locked rooms. A theatre where unseen actors whispered lines into the mouths of performers who believed themselves autonomous. He had found his calling not in nerves or tissue, but in the shadows behind them. By 1886, Freud stood at the threshold of a revolution he himself did not fully comprehend. He had gathered the tools, the rigour of Brucker, the anatomical insight of Meinert, the daring of Charcot, the pressure of love, and the hunger for truth. Now something waited to be born. Vienna still slept behind its polished facade, unaware that one of its sons was preparing to expose the dream beneath its waking life. Freud did not yet know the words he would one day engrave on the world: unconscious, repression, Oedipus complex, libido. He did not know that he would unravel the very fabric of identity, that he would stand accused of indecency and genius in equal measure, that he would become either a prophet or a heretic depending on who dared to listen. But he felt something stirring inside him, as if a great beast paced behind the doors of his mind, demanding release. The doctor had been forged, the explorer was ready, the unconscious was waiting. Part 3. Into the depths, dreams, desire, and the birth of psychoanalysis, 1886 and 1900. When Sigmund Freud returned to Vienna in 1886, he did not return as the same man who had left. Paris had changed him. Charcot had shown him something he could not unsee, that the mind was not a fortress of rationality, but a field of hidden forces, where memories and emotions lay buried like dormant volcanoes beneath the surface of polite society. Vienna, glittering as ever with its orchestras and palaces, now seemed to Freud like a stage play, in which the actors moved gracefully according to invisible scripts they themselves did not understand. And Freud, no longer willing to accept the simple explanations of medical textbooks, became determined to uncover the lines of that script, to reveal the hidden author beneath human behaviour. He opened his medical practice in Vienna's respectable Josefstadt district, offering treatments for nervous conditions. Yet the patients who arrived at his door brought him far more than he expected. They came trembling with anxieties no physical examination could explain. They spoke of strange compulsions, disturbing thoughts, paralysing fears. Some were suddenly unable to walk, though their muscles were healthy. Others experienced blindness without any damage to the eye. Their bodies bore symptoms of something unseen, as if their minds had found a way to speak through flesh when words failed them. These were the same phenomena Freud had witnessed in Charcot's clinic, but here in conservative Vienna they were dismissed as exaggerations or feminine weakness. Freud, however, sensed something deeper. He began experimenting with hypnosis, placing patients into trance states to loosen the barriers of consciousness. When submerged in that twilight condition, their guarded minds slipped, and out spilled stories they could not tell while awake. Childhood humiliations, forbidden longings, fears whispered only to the dark. But hypnosis was unpredictable. Some patients resisted its pull. Others reacted so strongly that Freud feared he was peering into abysses the medical establishment was not prepared to acknowledge. He became fascinated not with hypnosis itself, but with what lay beneath it, the hidden strata of the psyche that hypnosis momentarily revealed. Gradually, Freud noticed something remarkable. His patients often improved, not because he changed their bodies, but because he allowed them to speak. It was a peculiar thing. When a memory, long buried, was finally expressed aloud, the symptom attached to it sometimes dissolved, as if the body had been holding a secret that exhausted it, and confession, true, honest, uncensored confession, lifted the weight. Freud called this discovery the talking cure, though he did not yet grasp its full implications. It was around this time that Freud met a man who would shape the next stage of his intellectual journey, Joseph Breuer, a respected Viennese physician and friend of Freud's former professor. Breuer was everything Vienna admired: cultured, successful, socially graceful. But hidden beneath his polished exterior was a curiosity that mirrored Freud's. Breuer told Freud the story of a patient he had treated years earlier, a woman known to history as Anna O. She suffered from hallucinations, paralysis, anxieties, and speech disturbances, symptoms that came and went like weather. Breuer discovered that when Anna recounted certain forgotten or repressed memories, her symptoms vanished. She herself called the process chimney sweeping, as though dusting out the mind's hidden chimneys released something suffocating. Freud was electrified. Anna O's case was the missing bridge between Charcot's spectacle and Freud's intuition. If memories could make bodies tremble, if unspoken emotions could twist muscles and blind eyes, then the mind was far more powerful and far more dangerous than anyone had dared imagine. The symptoms were not illusions, They were coded messages. They were stories the patient could not bear to tell directly. The body spoke when the voice would not. Freud and Breuer collaborated on a book called Studies on Hysteria, published in 1895. In its pages, Freud's revolutionary voice emerged fully for the first time. The book argued that hysteria, long attributed to female weakness or moral failing, was instead the result of mental conflict, memories and desires banished from awareness, festering below consciousness, eventually bursting forth in physical symptoms. The mind, Freud declared, was divided, and repression, the silent burial of unwanted thoughts, was its governing mechanism. This idea was radical. It undermined centuries of belief in the rational self. It suggested that human beings did not control their thoughts, that consciousness was merely the surface of a turbulent sea. Freud's peers scoffed. Some dismissed him as melodramatic, others as dangerously speculative. But Freud no longer cared for their approval. He had ventured into the human mind's underworld, and no jeer or sneer could lure him back to safer ground. Around this time, Freud's life took on a peculiar duality. By day, he was an ambitious doctor, husband and father. By night, he became an explorer of dreams. His own dreams, his patients' dreams. Dreams recorded in notebooks with trembling excitement. Freud sensed that dreams were not meaningless fantasies, but windows into the mind's hidden chambers. They were coded messages from the unconscious, riddles waiting to be deciphered. He believed they held the keys to understanding desire, trauma, guilt, and identity. He began meticulously analysing his own dreams, exposing himself to the same scrutiny he demanded of others. One dream in particular became a turning point. Freud dreamed that his patient Irma was examined by doctors who blamed her symptoms on Freud's mistakes. He awoke shaken. Why had his mind put him on trial during sleep? As he examined the dream, Freud realised it expressed guilt, envy, fear of failure, and irritation toward colleagues. Dreams, he concluded, were not random. They were disguised expressions of forbidden wishes. The dream of Irma was the gateway through which Freud entered his own unconscious. He followed the symbols like footprints, tracing them backward until he found the emotional truth they concealed. This method became the core of psychoanalysis: interpretation, introspection, and the fearless pursuit of meaning. Freud now worked with a fervour bordering on obsession. His study filled with books, case notes, and sketches of neurological pathways. He paced the floors late into the night, puffing cigars, murmuring ideas aloud. His wife Martha slept while her husband mapped the invisible, his mind burning with questions that had no precedent in medical science. Where do dreams come from? Why do we forget painful experiences? Why do we desire what we know will harm us? Why is the mind at war with itself? Vienna outside his window slept beneath moonlight, unaware that in one room a man was dismantling the Enlightenment's most cherished assumption, that human beings are rational. Freud's investigations led him slowly toward his boldest claim: the mind is divided into conscious and unconscious realms. The conscious mind, he argued, is merely the tip of the iceberg. Small, exposed, proud, beneath lies the unconscious, vast, ancient, irrational, and dangerous. It contains everything we push away: rage, lust, shame, forbidden memories. To live, we must repress. To suffer, we must deny. To heal, we must uncover. As Freud worked, his ideas evolved like growing vines. Repression became the engine of neurosis. Dreams became messengers. Slip-ups in speech, those strange, embarrassing verbal accidents, became clues. The Freud who once dissected eels now dissected the human soul. Yet his growing insights brought isolation. Breuer, once his greatest ally, recoiled from the direction Freud took. Freud's insistence that sexuality sat at the core of psychic conflict unsettled Breuer. To Freud, sexual desire was not mere physical appetite, but a powerful psychic force shaping childhood, identity, morality, and fantasy. Breuer warned him against such conclusions, fearing scandal and professional suicide. But Freud saw something Breuer refused to acknowledge. Sexuality was not a side note of the psyche. It was its gravitational centre. The two men parted ways, marking Freud's first great intellectual break. It would not be his last. With the dawn of the new century approaching, Freud worked feverishly on a book that would define his career and scandalise the world. He poured his dreams, theories, and daring conjectures into a manuscript he titled Die Traumdeutung, The Interpretation of Dreams. Published in 1900, it marked the beginning of a new era, though its reception was chilly. Only a few copies sold. Critics ignored it. Colleagues pretended not to notice the earthquake occurring in their midst, but time would vindicate the dreamer. Freud later said he felt as though he were an archaeologist brushing dust from the buried ruins of the mind. He saw psychic life as a layered excavation site, recent memories on top, childhood impressions beneath, primal desires at the very bottom, breathing ancient air. No matter how modern a person seemed, Freud believed their emotional life was shaped by forces older than civilization itself. He began to speak of the psyche not as a single entity, but as a battlefield, reason struggling against desire, morality against instincts, the present against the past. Human beings, he concluded, were not masters of their fate. We were shaped by forces we neither chose nor understood. In Vienna, a city obsessed with appearances, this idea was heresy. But Freud was not seeking approval. He was pursuing truth, even if it led to exile. By the turn of the century, Freud had produced the foundations of psychoanalysis, the unconscious mind, repression, the central role of sexuality, and the interpretive power of dreams. He stood alone at the threshold of a new way of understanding human nature. The polite society of Vienna still waltzed in ballrooms, their smiles lacquered, their desires hidden beneath etiquette. They believed civilization was progress. Freud believed civilization was repression. He looked into the mirror of humanity and saw not reason, but conflict, not clarity, but contradiction, not purity, but desire. He saw the human being not as a hero, but as a mystery. The century would never be the same. Part 4. The Apostate and the Prophet. The dawn of the 20th century found Sigmund Freud standing alone in a quiet storm of his own making. He was 44 years old, no longer young, but not yet an elder, a man whose intellectual fire burned hotter with each passing year. Vienna swirled around him like a great theatre. Horse-drawn carriages rattled over cobblestone streets. Aristocrats whispered scandals behind lace fans, and a rising hum of modernity crept into daily life. Yet the city was unaware that in a modest apartment on Berggasse 19, a quiet revolution had begun. It was here, behind green-shaded lamps and closed curtains, that Freud developed his radical new science of the mind, a science that threatened to undermine the beliefs that polite society held most dear. For Freud, the publication of the Interpretation of Dreams in 1900 was not an endpoint, but the laying of a cornerstone. The world mistakenly believes that revolutions begin with applause. Freud learned they more often begin with silence. His book sold poorly, ignored by academics who found its subject matter distasteful or its conclusions outrageous. The idea that dreams, those nightly phantoms we so often dismiss, were encrypted messages from the unconscious struck many as ludicrous. Yet Freud remained undeterred. His work was not meant for the inattentive. He believed that a future generation would one day read his book and find revealed within its pages the blueprint of the human soul. As the early years of the century unfolded, Freud refined his theories through the daily labour of listening, truly listening, to his patients. He abandoned hypnosis entirely, replacing it with a method he called free association, encouraging his patients to speak whatever came to mind without censorship. Words that seemed trivial became keys. Pauses became clues. Jokes and slips of the tongue became doors to hidden truths. He began to notice patterns that repeated across cases. Repressed desires seeking expression. Childhood wounds that never healed. Fantasies that shaped adult destinies. The unconscious was not merely a storage chamber of forgotten memories. It was alive, restless, and cunning. Yet even geniuses require disciples. Freud understood that psychoanalysis needed more than one mind if it was to survive the hostile climate of his age. He began gathering a circle around him, a small group of men who met in his home on Wednesday evenings, which Freud called his Wednesday Psychological Society. They smoked cigars, debated ideas, and argued late into the night while the rest of Vienna slept. What began as an informal gathering evolved into the first psychoanalytic movement, a brotherhood forged not through blood, but through shared fascination with the unseen. Among those who joined the circle were Alfred Adler, Otto Rank, Wilhelm Stekel, and eventually a figure who would become both Freud's intellectual heir and his greatest disappointment, Carl Gustav Jung. Jung was younger, handsome, and charismatic, a Swiss psychiatrist from the Burghölzli Clinic in Zurich. He held a fascination for madness that matched Freud's own, and he approached Freud's ideas not as a student, but as a visionary eager to push beyond boundaries. Their meeting in 1907 lasted 13 hours, an encounter so intense that Freud later described it as if lightning had struck the room. Freud saw in Jung something he had longed for, a successor who could carry psychoanalysis beyond the Jewish intellectual circles of Vienna and into the broader world. Freud believed, with some sadness, that as long as psychoanalysis remained associated with Jews, it would be dismissed by European academies poisoned by anti-Semitism. Jung, Protestant and Swiss, seemed to Freud like a passport into respectability. For a brief moment, the two men seemed destined to reshape humanity's understanding of itself together. Their correspondence became a river of ideas. Dreams, theories, and personal confessions poured back and forth between Vienna and Zurich. Freud addressed Jung as "my son," though the sentiment was more complex than paternal affection. Freud felt a mixture of admiration and dependency, a recognition that Jung could take psychoanalysis to heights Freud could never reach alone. Jung, for his part, revered Freud but chafed under the older man's certainty. Their bond was made not of symmetry, but tension. During these years, Freud expanded his theoretical map of the psyche. He wrote essays that unsettled Europe, asserting that slips of the tongue revealed secret wishes, that jokes disguised aggression, that religion was humanity's shared neurosis, and that childhood was the crucible in which all later suffering was forged. His ideas fell on the world like thunderclaps. People who once believed themselves rational realized, sometimes with horror, that irrational forces moved them like puppets. Freud had stolen the Enlightenment's crown jewel, the sovereignty of reason, and revealed it to be a comforting illusion. Of all Freud's theories, none provoked more outrage than the Oedipus complex. Drawing inspiration from the ancient Greek tragedy of King Oedipus, Freud claimed that every child seeks, unconsciously, to possess the parent of the opposite sex and eliminate the rival parent. To speak such a notion aloud was scandalous. Victorian society, obsessed with propriety, nearly fainted at the implication that innocent children harboured such desires. Yet Freud believed the scandal lay not in his theory, but in humanity's refusal to face what pulsated beneath its polished exterior. At the same time, he introduced the concept of infantile sexuality, arguing that sexuality did not arrive suddenly with puberty, but existed from birth in evolving forms. He insisted that repression, the mind's attempt to bury desires and fears, was both the glue of civilization and the source of neurosis. To live in society required hiding parts of oneself. To hide too much was to become ill. Freud, with unnerving precision, suggested that civilization itself was a shared lie. It was during this period that Freud experienced a series of fainting spells around Jung, episodes that carried the symbolic weight of myth. Freud refused to be analysed by Jung, fearing the younger man would uncover truths Freud was unwilling to confront. Their roles were already shifting. Freud wanted disciples. Jung wanted colleagues. Freud sought loyalty. Jung sought autonomy. Like tectonic plates grinding beneath the surface, their union was destined to rupture. Yet before the break came triumph. In 1909, Freud, Jung, and others crossed the Atlantic to lecture at Clark University in Massachusetts, marking the first time psychoanalysis set foot on American soil. Students and academics listened in rapt fascination as Freud delivered lectures that decades later would be regarded as foundational texts. America, hungry for new ideas, embraced psychoanalysis with a fervour that astonished Freud. The journey was a validation. His ideas, once ignored, now echoed across oceans. But fame is a double-edged sword. As psychoanalysis spread, disagreements sharpened. Jung began to diverge from Freud's emphasis on sexuality as the primary engine of the unconscious. He saw broader forces at work: archetypes, myths, spiritual impulses. Freud accused Jung of abandoning science for mysticism. Jung accused Freud of reducing the human spirit to libido. Freud believed Jung's deviations threatened the foundation he had spent decades constructing. He had not fought the world, only to see his creation reshaped beyond recognition. The tension between them grew unbearable. Letters turned brittle. Meetings crackled with hostility. Jung, who once adored Freud, now felt suffocated. Freud, who once saw Jung as the future, now felt betrayed. The psychoanalytic movement split like a fractured mirror, each shard reflecting a different image of the mind. Their final break in 1913 was not merely personal, it was epical. Freud collapsed emotionally afterwards, feeling as if he had lost a son. Jung later wrote of dreams filled with blood and devastation, as though humanity's psyche itself had torn open. The world would come to see their split not as a quarrel, but as the birth of two rival empires of thought. Freud emerged from the rupture hardened, certain that psychoanalysis could not rely on charisma or consensus. It required structure, rigour, and doctrine. He became its architect and defender, shaping the movement like a fortress, even as he wondered whether the fortress had cost him too much. By 1913, Freud stood at the height of his powers, yet more isolated than ever. His ideas had spread to America, Russia, Germany, and beyond, but he remained a man misunderstood by his own era. The world saw scandal, Freud saw truth. Society clung to respectability. Freud revealed its mask. The apostate had become a prophet, though prophecy is a lonely occupation. Freud now understood that anyone who reveals hidden truths must walk alone for stretches of the journey. He once believed others would share the load, but now he knew the unconscious was his realm, his burden, his destiny. Outside, Europe marched toward catastrophe, unaware that Freud had already uncovered the deeper catastrophe within. The war waged inside every soul. The next chapter of his life would fuse the personal and the historical, as the world itself descended into violence that Freud believed human nature had always harboured. Civilization was cracking, and Freud was ready to understand why. Part 5. Civilization on the Couch. In the years following his break with Carl Jung, Sigmund Freud stood at a crossroads that was both deeply personal and profoundly historical. The rupture had shaken him in ways he struggled to articulate. Jung had been more than a colleague. He had been the embodiment of Freud's hope that psychoanalysis might transcend the boundaries of culture, religion, and nationality. Now, that hope had fractured, leaving behind a man whose resolve had hardened even as his circle diminished. Freud, who once imagined himself the founder of a movement grounded in shared exploration, now found himself the guardian of a doctrine he feared the world would distort if he did not protect it. The father of psychoanalysis had become its watchman. Yet as Freud wrestled with the burdens of leadership, the world outside his study began to tremble. Europe stood on the threshold of catastrophe, though few recognized the severity of the approaching storm. In 1913, cafe conversations in Vienna buzzed not with fear, but optimism. New technologies promised progress. Cities grew, national pride swelled. The Enlightenment dream of a rational, orderly, civilized humanity seemed finally within reach. And yet Freud sensed something beneath the surface, something darker and older than the bright confidence on display. He believed that civilization didn't refine humanity, it only restrained it. Beneath the polished veneer of modern life, he saw the same primitive impulses that had moved our ancestors to violence, domination, and desire. The more society demanded moderation and restraint, the more pressure mounted beneath the psychic dam. Freud's study became the space where he attempted to understand the hidden tension between humanity's instincts and society's expectations. He saw the unconscious not merely as the birthplace of personal conflict, but as the reservoir of a species' ancient history, a psychic fossil bed layered with forgotten struggles and unresolved terrors. He believed that the mind of modern man carried remnants of primal urges, unchanged despite centuries of cultural evolution. Civilization, he argued, was built atop an inner battlefield where instinct and repression constantly collided. In this state of intellectual and emotional turmoil, Freud turned increasingly toward theory. His writing became more ambitious, more sweeping in scope, as he sought not merely to heal individuals, but to diagnose humanity itself. He asked questions others did not dare ask. What if civilization is not humanity's salvation, but humanity's neurosis? What if morality is not noble, but imposed, an enforced denial of our deepest impulses? What if religion, patriotism, and cultural refinement are elaborate defences that keep us from confronting truths we cannot bear? Then came the blow that exposed the fragility of the Enlightenment dream. In June 1914, gunshots in Sarajevo shattered Europe's precarious balance. Within weeks, alliances collapsed into war. Nations mobilized armies with numbing enthusiasm. Millions marched to the front with hymns on their lips and flags in their hands. Freud watched with horror as Europe, educated, refined, modern, descended into carnage with a fervour that seemed almost ecstatic. The veneer of civilization dissolved overnight, revealing something primal and ravenous beneath. The First World War confirmed Freud's darkest suspicions. He had once believed that sexuality was the core of psychic life, an instinctual energy he called libido. But now he saw something else rise from the depths. The instinct toward destruction, cruelty, domination. It was as though humanity had unmasked itself, revealing a desire not only to possess, but to annihilate. The trenches of France and the battlefields of Galicia became the physical manifestation of Freud's psychological landscape. Here, in mud and blood, instinct defied reason, and repression crumbled into chaos. The war transformed Freud's thought. He began to study aggression, the human fascination with ruin and suffering. Why did soldiers volunteer? Why did citizens cheer the carnage from afar? Why did nations treat death not as tragedy, but as sacrifice? Freud concluded that civilization had always relied on the redirection of aggression, toward outside enemies when possible, toward oneself when not. His earlier vision of humanity, centered on desire and repression, now expanded to include a darker force, the death drive, a compulsion toward self-destruction and dissolution that haunted the psyche like a shadow. Freud did not welcome this discovery. He had hoped that psychoanalysis might help humanity understand its hidden motivations and perhaps free itself from needless suffering. But the war shattered that hope. He watched as reason became propaganda, as intellect bowed before instinct, as nations traded their young for illusions of honour. It seemed that psychoanalysis had arrived too late, not to prevent catastrophe, but merely to explain it. During these bleak years, Freud continued his clinical work, though patients were fewer and financial pressures grew, heavier. Food shortages plagued Vienna. Inflation gnawed at savings. Freud's sons were drafted into the Austro-Hungarian army. His daughter Anna, whom he adored, became ill. The psychoanalytic movement struggled to survive as its members scattered, some conscripted, others displaced. Freud's study, once a sanctuary of ideas, felt increasingly like a bunker where he fought against both external turmoil and internal doubts. Yet Freud did not succumb. He wrote with a fervour that surprised even him, as though the world's collapse demanded that he explain why such collapse was inevitable. In 1915, he published essays that would become cornerstones of modern psychology. Explorations of the unconscious, repression, mourning, and the difference between grief that heals and grief that festers. He argued that trauma was not a wound inflicted once, but a force that returned again and again, seeking resolution through dreams, symptoms, or silence. His work offered insight into the psychic injuries inflicted by war, not only on soldiers, but on entire societies. Freud did not see the war as an aberration. He saw it as a revelation. Civilization had always been constructed atop buried aggression, and now that aggression had erupted. The war was proof that humanity was not guided by reason, but driven by forces that civilization barely contained. Freud became convinced that the unconscious was not merely a repository of desire, but a stage on which the dramas of history played out. Nations, like individuals, repressed their fears, projected their insecurities, and acted out their fantasies with terrifying conviction. As the war dragged on, Freud made a decision that would shape the rest of psychoanalysis. He would not retreat from the darker aspects of the human mind. If his contemporaries wanted optimism, they could look to religion or politics. Freud would offer something else: clarity. In 1917, he published introductory lectures on psychoanalysis, a vast and accessible work that distilled years of theory into a form the public could grasp. The book explained dreams, neuroses, slips of the tongue, and repression with unprecedented clarity. Readers found in Freud's work a mirror, distorted, unsettling, yet undeniable. The war had eroded certainties. Psychoanalysis offered explanations. Demand for Freud's ideas surged, not because they comforted, but because they named what civilization could no longer ignore. Around this time, Freud's attention turned increasingly toward his daughter Anna. She was intelligent, thoughtful, and introspective, and Freud recognized in her a mind capable of carrying forward the psychoanalytic legacy. Anna became his closest intellectual companion, the daughter who followed him not into the world, but into the labyrinth of the psyche. Their relationship, complex and deeply emotional, would become a subject of fascination and speculation for later generations. By 1918, the war finally ended, leaving Europe shattered. Freud saw the end not as peace, but as exhaustion, an interlude between convulsions. The world had changed, and psychoanalysis had changed with it. No longer merely a theory of dreams and desire, it had become a lens through which the century would understand trauma, aggression, love, and loss. Freud thought of civilization as a compromise, an uneasy truce between instinct and restraint. The war had revealed what happened when that truce collapsed. Now, he believed, psychoanalysis must address not only the individual, but the collective. He saw nations as organisms driven by unconscious forces, capable of neurosis, projection, and self-deception. The tools he had developed for treating patients seemed increasingly applicable to the world stage. Still, Freud was not triumphant. He was weary, older, and aware that the truths he uncovered did not heal easily. The war had confirmed what he long suspected, that reason alone could not tame the psyche, and that human beings were forever divided against themselves. Yet Freud did not despair. Instead, he resolved to push further. If humanity could not escape its instinctual nature, perhaps it could at least understand it. Insight, he believed, was the closest thing to redemption. As the 1920s dawned, Freud stood like a physician who had diagnosed a patient no longer hiding symptoms. Civilization, he believed, would never again pretend innocence. His task now was to map the psyche with greater precision, to refine psychoanalysis into a discipline that could withstand resistance, misunderstanding, and distortion. He did not yet know that the next phase of his work would lead him to theories that would eclipse his earlier achievements, reshaping modern identity in ways even he could not foresee. The mind he had uncovered was not merely conflicted, it was structured. Beneath dreams and desires lay machinery, complex, dynamic, and universal. Freud was about to reveal its blueprint. The world, still reeling from war, was about to discover that peace offered no refuge from the inner battles every human being fought alone. The age of the unconscious had begun. Part 6. The Mind Divided. The 1920s arrived like a strange dawn, bright with the promises of modernity, yet trembling with the aftershocks of a world war that had shattered illusions of progress. Vienna, once the glittering capital of European refinement, was now a city haunted by the ghosts of a lost empire. Austro-Hungarian banners had fallen, borders had dissolved, and people roamed the streets with uncertainty in their eyes, as if waking from a dream they could no longer interpret. In his apartment on Berggasse 19, Sigmund Freud watched this transformation quietly, puffing on cigars while the world he had known unravelled. But Freud was not mourning the past. He was busy dissecting the psychic forces that had brought civilization to its knees. Freud had spent decades uncovering the hidden mechanisms of desire, repression, dreams, and neurosis, Yet, something still troubled him. His earlier models of the mind, conscious, preconscious, unconscious, felt incomplete. They described where thoughts resided, but not how they thought. Freud saw conflict everywhere, in his patients, in families, in nations. Something inside the psyche was always pulling in opposing directions. Desire clashed with duty. Pleasure collided with fear. Memory wrestled with morality. The human mind was not a place of harmony, but a battlefield. He realized that his earlier theory lacked a structure robust enough to explain these internal wars. The unconscious was not a single, unified space. It was a swarm of forces, layered and competing. Freud sensed that there must be distinct agencies within the mind, psychic characters with different agendas. And so, around 1920, he began forging a new map of the psyche, one that would not merely describe the contents of the unconscious, but the architecture behind every human choice. His work on trauma and death instincts during the war had convinced him that desire alone could not explain human behavior. There was another force, dark, destructive, seeking dissolution rather than fulfillment. Civilization's collapse had revealed aggression not as an accident, but as an instinct. Freud now believed that human life was driven by two great energies: the instinct to live, love, bind, and create, which he called eros, and the instinct to destroy, tear apart, and return to nothingness, which he named thanatos. These instincts roared beneath the surface of every psyche, locked in eternal struggle. The human mind was not a poet. They were not metaphors. They were laws. To integrate these insights, Freud introduced a model of the mind that would become one of the most recognizable frameworks in psychology. He called its components the id, the ego, and the superego. The terms have become so familiar that we forget their origins, as though they were always there, etched in the soul. But before Freud, no such structure existed. He gave the psyche a skeleton. The id, Freud proposed, was the oldest and most primitive part of the mind, a cauldron of instinct, desire, and impulse. It did not think, it demanded. It did not plan, it wanted. To the id, there was no morality, no consequence, no time. It spoke a single language: pleasure. The cries of the infant, the ache of hunger, the heat of lust, the thrill of rage, these were the id's voice. Freud saw it not as evil, but as elemental, the psychic residue of humanity's biological origins. The ego emerged from the id like a captain forced to steer a ship built by someone else. It grew out of experience, negotiation, and contact with reality. The ego was the mediator, tasked with balancing the id's demands with the constraints of the external world. Where the id insisted, the ego reasoned. Where the id shouted, the ego whispered. The ego was the seat of what we call I, though Freud argued this sense of self was more fragile and compromised than we like to admit. The ego believed it was in control, yet it was forever caught between hunger and prohibition. The superego was the last to form, a product of society's imprint on the psyche. It was the internalized voice of parents, teachers, faith, and law, the whisper of what one ought to do, the judgment that punished forbidden fantasies, the guardian of ideals. Freud saw the superego not merely as conscience, but as a tyrant forged from love and fear. It policed the psyche, often harshly, turning instinct against itself. Civilization worked, Freud argued, because the superego carved the wildness of the id into acceptable forms. But this carving came at a cost. The superego did not merely protect, it tormented. With this triadic structure, Freud believed he had captured the psychic machinery that produced both dreams and wars, neuroses and nations. Humanity was not conflicted by accident. The conflict was baked into the system. The ID demanded gratification, the superego demanded restraint, and the ego struggled to keep them from tearing the mind apart. Freud saw in this tension the root of anxiety, guilt, creativity, repression, art, love, hatred, everything. Vienna, still grieving its lost empire, did not know that the man walking its streets had redrawn the map of the soul. Freud would stroll through the city, cane tapping gently, cigar in hand, passing cafes where young artists and intellectuals debated modernism. But while others argued about styles, Freud pondered instincts older than history. He believed that the psyche, like ancient ruins, had been built atop older structures. He was the archaeologist of desire, brushing away layers of civilization until only the raw instinct remained. His ideas grew not only in complexity but in daring. He wrote Beyond the Pleasure Principle in 1920, articulating the existence of the death drive, a force that compelled repetition and returned to an earlier, lifeless state. The concept horrified many, including his own followers. They had accepted sexuality as a powerful motivator, but death as an instinct was too much. Still, Freud held firm. He saw in trauma a compulsion to return to pain, in war a collective drive toward ruin. Humanity, he believed, did not fear destruction. It flirted with it. Freud also began exploring the ego in greater depth, describing its defences, compromises, and illusions. Defence mechanisms, repression, denial, projection, sublimation, were not flaws but survival strategies. The ego shielded itself from truths it could not bear, truths that threatened the fragile balance between desire and duty. Freud did not condemn such defences. He understood them. Without defences, the mind would shatter. His theories now reached beyond clinics and consultations. They touched literature, politics, religion, art. The world was no longer content to read Freud. People began to read themselves through him. Writers reconsidered characters, theologians reconsidered sin, politicians reconsidered propaganda. Freud had handed humanity a mirror, and what people saw frightened them. Yet despite the growing fame of psychoanalysis, Freud remained sceptical of popularity. Ideas, he believed, were easily appropriated and misunderstood. Already he sensed distortions. Some disciples wanted to soften psychoanalysis into self-help. Others wished to turn it into ideology. Freud resisted them all. He valued clarity over comfort, truth over acceptance. His own life was changing as well. His children had grown, each choosing a path that reflected Freud's shadow. His daughter Sophie, radiant and beloved, became the joy of his later years. Anna, his youngest, became his intellectual heir, attending congresses and engaging in the work that carried psychoanalysis beyond Vienna. Freud felt pride, but also anxiety. The psyche was a dangerous landscape, and Anna walked into it willingly. Meanwhile, Freud's health began to falter. He developed lesions on his jaw, early signs of the cancer that would one day claim his life. He refused to quit smoking. Cigars were not merely habit, they were his refuge, his companion in the quiet hours when ideas took shape. His doctors warned him. Freud shrugged. He believed the psyche chose its destinies long before consciousness caught up. Despite his pain, Freud wrote with increasing urgency. The world was sliding toward new dangers. Economic instability, rising nationalism, resentments disguised as ideologies. Freud saw these forces not as political accidents, but as psychological inevitabilities. Repression, whether in individuals or societies, did not dissipate. It returned. It always returned. By the mid-1920s, Freud's structural model of the psyche, ego, superego, had become the cornerstone of psychoanalysis. It explained why people acted against their own interests, why they suffered guilt without cause, why civilizations preached love while waging war. Freud had given humanity not a cure, but an explanation. We suffer because we are divided. We are born into conflict. We are driven by forces we did not choose. The world would never think of the mind the same way again. Freud, however, remained unsentimental. He believed that insight did not free us. It humbled us. The ego was not king of the psyche. It was a mediator, a diplomat negotiating with tyrants. The superego condemned. The id desired. The ego endured. And in that endurance, Freud saw the essence of human existence. As the decade neared its end, Freud sensed another storm gathering. Europe spoke the language of progress once more, but beneath it he heard something darker. Resentment, longing for authority, fantasies of purity. These were not political forces, they were psychic ones. Entire nations were slipping into regression, losing the fragile balance between instinct and restraint. Civilization was a thin crust. Freud could feel it cracking. He was about to witness the proof. The unconscious once, his private discovery, was preparing to take the world with it. Part 7. Freud in the Fire. The final decade of Sigmund Freud's life began not with triumph, but with tremors. Psychic, personal, and political. The 1920s had ended like a candle guttering in a sudden gust of wind, and the world entered the 1930s with a shiver running down its spine. Freud, now an old man with thinning hair, a carved cane, and a jaw ravaged by cancer, watched as Europe prepared once more to descend into darkness. Yet even as illness gnawed at his body and the civilized world around him began to crack, Freud refused to retreat. He had spent his life tracing the unseen forces that governed humanity. Now he would witness them unleashed. Vienna in the early 1930s was no longer the city of golden cafes and philosophical salons Freud had known in his youth. The empire had collapsed. The monarchy was gone. Economic hardship gnawed at the working class. Conversations that once revolved around music and literature now turned bitter, filled with suspicion and resentment. Hatreds long kept in check began to seep into everyday speech. Freud, ever attuned to the murmurs of the unconscious, recognized these changes not as something new, but as something ancient returning from its repression. His own life was marked by struggle. The cancer that had first appeared in 1923 had grown into a relentless foe. Surgeons removed parts of his jaw, leaving him disfigured and in constant pain. Eating became a torment. Speaking was an effort. Yet Freud refused pity, even from those closest to him. When asked how he coped with the agony, he answered with a trace of humour, "My cigars help me." Against all medical advice, he continued to smoke, the cigars clenched awkwardly in the prosthetic plate that replaced part of his palate. They were not a habit, they were identity, ritual, resistance. Despite his physical suffering, Freud wrote with a fierce clarity that astonished his contemporaries. In 1930, he published Civilization and Its Discontents, a book that seemed less like a diagnosis of the present and more like a premonition of the future. In it, Freud argued that civilization was not built on virtue, but on repression, that peace was merely a pause in the war between human instinct and communal necessity. Humans sacrificed instinctual freedom in exchange for security, and the price of that bargain was perpetual dissatisfaction. The more civilized society became, the more neurotic its members grew. Freud saw discontent not as a flaw of modern life, but as its inevitable outcome. The book resounded like a bell struck deep underground. Some readers were horrified, others felt exposed. A few quietly felt relieved. Someone was speaking a truth they had always sensed but never dared articulate. In Civilization and its Discontents, Freud did more than diagnose individuals. He diagnosed history. Meanwhile, Freud's personal world grew smaller. Friends died or drifted away. Colleagues departed Vienna, seeking safety or opportunity elsewhere. Freud's beloved daughter Sophie, bright and full of life, died suddenly in 1920 at just 26. Her death left Freud hollowed in a way no theory could fill. He had explained grief professionally, but now grief explained him. He wrote simply that losing a child was an incomprehensible blow. It was Anna, his youngest daughter and intellectual heir, who kept him anchored. Anna devoted her life to psychoanalysis, not merely as a disciple, but as a pioneer in her own right. Her work with children would later reshape the field. But in Freud's final years, she served another role. She protected him. She organised his schedule, filtered correspondence, managed the psychoanalytic community, and stood guard against those who wished to exploit or distort her father's work. She was the fortress Freud had never asked for but desperately needed. Still, even Anna could not shield her father from what loomed over Vienna. The rise of fascism in Germany sent shockwaves across Europe. Adolf Hitler, dismissed by many as a fanatic, now commanded a nation intoxicated by myth and vengeance. Freud, a Jew and a thinker, who exposed the irrationality hiding inside reason, became the embodiment of everything the new ideology despised. The Nazis burned his books in Berlin in 1933, declaring psychoanalysis a Jewish science. Freud responded with grim irony. What progress we are making! In the Middle Ages they would have burned me. Now they are content to burn my books. But the fire was coming closer. Austria clung to independence until 1938, when the Nazis marched into Vienna without resistance. Overnight, the streets Freud had walked for a lifetime were transformed. Swastikas draped buildings. Jewish businesses were vandalized. Former friends crossed the street to avoid conversation. The polite repression of hostility, something Freud understood better than anyone, had been lifted. The id of Europe stood grinning in the daylight. The Nazis soon came for Freud's family. His home was searched, his bank accounts were frozen. One of his sisters was interrogated. Psychoanalytic societies were dissolved. Freud himself, now frail and in pain, was instructed to report to the Gestapo. Friends urged him to flee, but Freud refused to leave Vienna. The city that had shaped him, challenged him, betrayed him, and defined him. It was Anna who finally convinced him. She was arrested and questioned by the Gestapo. Freud, faced with the possibility of losing another child, capitulated. Flight was no longer escape, it was survival. A remarkable network of colleagues and admirers mobilised to save him. Ernest Jones in London, Marie Bonaparte in Paris, William Bullitt in Washington, all worked feverishly to secure his departure. Bonaparte, a princess by blood and psychoanalyst by choice, paid ransom money to the Nazis to allow Freud to leave. Even then, the regime demanded a written declaration stating he had been treated well. Freud signed, then added a sentence dripping with defiance. I can heartily recommend the Gestapo to anyone. It was a final gesture of wit from a man staring into the abyss. In June 1938, at the age of 82, Freud boarded a train out of Vienna. As it rolled away, he leaned on his cane and looked silently through the window at the city he would never see again. Behind him remained 4 of his sisters. All 4 would later perish in the camps. Freud arrived in London exhausted, ill and grieving, yet alive. The British capital, wrapped in fog and soot, offered refuge but not comfort. Freud settled into a modest house in Hampstead, where he reconstructed his famous study with its statues of Egyptian gods and Greek heroes, silent companions of a lifetime spent wrestling the psyche into language. These ancient figures, embodiments of myth and instinct, had always watched him work. Now they would watch him die. His illness worsened. The cancer in his jaw grew monstrous. Eating became nearly impossible. Pain followed him like a shadow. Still, Freud continued to write. His final book, Moses and Monotheism, challenged the very roots of Western religion, arguing that Judaism, and by extension Christianity, was founded not on revelation, but on repression of trauma. It was a scandalous argument made by a dying man who no longer cared whom he offended. Freud believed that truth was not dependent on comfort. He had spent a lifetime insisting that people must confront what they feared most. Anna remained by his side, helping him speak when his voice faltered. Friends visited, astonished by his endurance. Freud greeted them with dry humour, even as his body betrayed him. But by September 1939, he could no longer bear the pain. He asked his doctor to administer morphine, 3 doses, enough to silence the fire consuming him. The doctor complied. Freud slipped quietly into unconsciousness and died on September 23rd. He departed the world just weeks after Hitler ignited the Second World War. Freud had warned that civilization was always one breath away from collapse. He did not live to see the worst of what was coming, but he had already diagnosed it. His final act was exit, not escape. When Freud died, psychoanalysis was scattered across continents. Its founder in London, disciples in America. Ideas spreading into psychology, literature, film, anthropology, and education. He did not live to see his theories debated in classrooms, invoked in therapy, distorted in pop culture, embedded in the vocabulary of modern life. The unconscious, the ego, repression, projection, defense mechanisms. All of it, the common speech of the modern world, rose from one man's relentless pursuit of truth. Freud never claimed that human beings were noble. He never promised redemption. He believed the psyche was a labyrinth from which no one emerged unscathed. But he did something extraordinary. He opened the door. He showed us that within every human life lies a hidden story, told not in words but in slips, dreams, fears, and desires. He taught us that the enemy is not outside, it is within, and knowing that enemy, listening to it, might be our only chance at peace. Freud lived in fire, and fire consumed his century. His ideas remain embers in ours. Whether we fear them, reject them, or embrace them, we cannot ignore them. He changed the way we think. He changed the way we dream. He changed what it means to be human. Part 8. The shadow of his influence. When Sigmund Freud died in 1939, the earth did not shake, no bells tolled across cities, and most of the world turned its gaze not towards psychoanalysis, but toward a Europe spiralling into war. Yet something profound had shifted, something no newspaper headline captured. Freud had unleashed a transformation so subtle, so insidious, that it would take generations to recognize. He had altered the very way humanity thinks about itself. His body may have succumbed to illness, but his theories remained alive, restless, persistent, seeking new hosts. In the months and years that followed his passing, Freud's absence became strangely immaterial. His ideas refused to remain confined to textbooks or to the consulting rooms of analysts. They drifted outward like spores on the wind, settling in places and disciplines that Freud himself might never have imagined. Psychoanalysis, once a radical doctrine confined to a small circle of Viennese rebels, found itself transported into the bloodstream of Western culture. Freud had predicted none of this. He had imagined psychoanalysis as a medical practice, a way to treat neurosis, perhaps a set of theories debated among specialists. He could not have foreseen that it would permeate literature, film, art, politics, advertising, feminism, anthropology, and even architecture. It was as though Freud had tapped into a subterranean river, and once the earth split open, it flowed everywhere. The first wave of Freud's posthumous influence was carried by the analysts who had escaped Europe. Many fled Vienna and Berlin ahead of fascism's advance, scattering like seeds across continents. Ernest Jones sailed to England and transformed London into a psychoanalytic hub. In the United States, psychoanalysis took root with astonishing vigour, reshaping American psychiatry and therapy for half a century. Buenos Aires emerged as an unlikely stronghold, where psychoanalysis became almost a civic religion. What Freud began in one apartment now had homes in dozens of cities. But the movement did not remain unified. Freud's followers soon diverged, arguing not over whether he was right, but over what he meant. Some insisted that the id, ego, and superego form the foundation of psychic life. Others ventured into theories Freud would have rejected. Melanie Klein, working in London, turned her attention to infants and argued that unconscious fantasies governed life from the cradle. Donald Winnicott examined the earliest relationships between mother and child. Jacques Lacan, enigmatic and brilliant, declared that Freud's true discovery lay not in instincts, but in language itself. These were not betrayals. They were symptoms. Freud had never given the world a closed system. He had unearthed a method of thinking. Once people learned to ask his questions, to look beneath surfaces, to distrust rational explanations, to listen for the whisper behind the words, there was no turning back. Writers were among the first to seize upon his insights. Virginia Woolf traced consciousness as though it were a shifting river, currents of memory pulling characters beneath their own thoughts. Franz Kafka wrote characters trapped in labyrinths they could not understand, caught in the machinery of guilt without a crime. Marcel Proust gave memory itself a psychoanalytic pulse, where the smallest sensation reopened vast chambers of forgotten emotion. These authors were not Freud's disciples, but they breathed the same psychic air he had released. Cinema followed. The camera became an instrument of the unconscious. Hitchcock explored paranoia and desire with chilling precision. Film noir bathed city streets in psychological shadows. Directors used dreams not to confuse, but to reveal, embracing Freud's belief that dreams speak truth sideways. Long before depth psychology became a term, filmmakers were already staging it. Advertising embraced Freud's ideas with unsettling enthusiasm. If desires lay hidden, then selling required shaping them. Edward Bernays, Freud's nephew, used psychoanalytic insights to invent modern public relations. Cigarettes became symbols of power. Products became answers to unspoken anxieties. And mass persuasion became a tool to bypass reason entirely. Freud had wanted to heal minds. Others learned to manipulate them. Meanwhile, psychiatry shifted beneath Freud's influence. Therapists no longer treated patients as malfunctioning machines, but as haunted beings whose symptoms were not accidents but messages. They spoke of complexes, transference, childhood trauma, unconscious conflict. Even those who rejected Freud could not ignore the questions he posed, because once heard, they lingered. But Freud's influence was not confined to clinics and universities. It seeped into the way ordinary people spoke, thought, and judged themselves. Parents worried about damaging their children. Couples interpreted their conflicts through hidden motives. People paused when they said something unintended, wondering if a Freudian slip had revealed a secret. Dreams that were once dismissed as nonsense became puzzles to interpret. Repression entered everyday vocabulary. Humour became diagnostic. Love became a battleground. Freud had given language to the invisible, and once named, the invisible refused to disappear. Yet his legacy was not without resistance. Critics emerged on every front. Behaviourists claimed the unconscious was unscientific. Neuroscientists argued the brain, not dreams, held the key to understanding the mind. Feminists accused Freud of reducing women to fantasies forged by male desire. Postmodernists accused him of replacing one authoritarian narrative with another. The more Freud's ideas spread, the more fiercely they were contested. But this, too, was part of the design. Freud had argued that the human psyche resists truth. It protects itself from discomfort. It denies what it cannot bear. To criticize Freud was often to enact Freud. His ideas became unfalsifiable, not through dogma, but through relevance. Still, the question lingered. Was Freud right? The answer, if one followed Freud's logic, was the wrong question. Freud had not given the world a mirror that reflected objective reality. He had given it a mirror that reflected desire. He had revealed that identity was not a stable structure, but a compromise between instinct, history, and imagination. He taught humanity that the self is not a fortress, but a stage on which unseen actors perform. As decades passed, science advanced in directions Freud could never have foreseen. Machines read brain activity. Computers modelled cognition. The mind was probed with tools more precise than any psychoanalytic technique. Yet again and again, research returned to something Freud had intuited. That consciousness is only a fragment of mental life. That decisions emerge before we are aware of them. That memory is not a library but a construction. That emotion colours thought before thought guides action. Freud did not explain everything, but he named what had been unnamed. He called attention to the ghost beneath reason. He made the unconscious undeniable. In this sense, Freud's legacy is not a museum of doctrines, but a shift in gravity. Before Freud, to understand oneself was to examine beliefs and intentions. After Freud, to understand oneself was to enter a labyrinth, one where memory, fantasy, desire, fear, guilt, and instinct intersected in ways both compelling and terrifying. Human beings had become mysteries to themselves. The greatest paradox of Freud's legacy is that he made self-awareness more difficult, not easier. He stripped away illusions, but did not offer replacements. He revealed mechanisms, but refused reassurance. Freud opened doors without telling anyone what waited beyond them. And yet people kept walking through. Perhaps they always will. Freud once wrote that the task of analysis is endless. The psyche is not something to be mastered, but something to be explored, layer by layer, generation after generation. His theories may evolve, mutate, or be challenged, but the impulse he awakened, the desire to look inward, to uncover the hidden narrative of one's life, remains. The world did not adopt psychoanalysis. It became psychoanalytic. Long after Freud's voice fell silent, human beings continue to wrestle with the forces he revealed. Therapists listen. Patients speak. Dreams disturb. Words betray. The unconscious persists. Freud once warned that civilization's greatest achievements conceal its greatest wounds. He believed the mind was an unfinished story, always threatening to contradict itself. He did not imagine a world without conflict. He imagined a world willing to witness its own contradictions. And in that willingness, he saw a possibility, not of peace, but of understanding. Freud is gone, but the shadow he cast stretches across every field that touches the human condition. Artists trace it. Scientists measure it. Lovers feel it. Nations enact it. Children inherit it. His legacy is not belief. It is perspective, not answers. Questions, not comfort. Depth. The world continues to dream, to desire, to fear, to lie, to confess. The unconscious continues its silent work. Freud simply taught us how to listen. Part 9. The mind that would not sleep. Long after Sigmund Freud's death, something curious happened. Instead of fading into history, he seemed to grow larger. His ideas, once debated in Viennese cafes and discussed in hushed tones among analysts, now crept into places where Freud himself never set foot. They settled into classrooms, influenced legal systems, shaped theories of crime, moulded advertising, and recast entire fields of study. Freud became not merely a figure of the past, but a presence, the kind that lingers in the corner of a room, silent yet undeniable. Yet it was not fame that made Freud endure. Fame is fragile. It breaks easily, like thin ice in spring. What kept Freud alive was something deeper. The human mind was beginning to recognize itself differently. Freud had not invented the unconscious. He had revealed that it had always been there, whispering in dreams, slipping into speech, erupting in moments of desire and shame. Once seen, it could not be unseen. In the years following the Second World War, psychoanalysis underwent a remarkable transformation. The discipline that Freud had struggled to legitimize now became the dominant mode of psychological thought, especially in the United States. Soldiers returning from the battlefields of Europe and the Pacific carried invisible wounds. Nightmares, tremors, sudden anxieties, and a fear without object. Symptoms that no traditional doctor could explain. Psychoanalysis offered a vocabulary where none had existed. Trauma became a field, not a mystery. Memory became a battleground. The unconscious, once abstract, now felt tangible, almost physical. American cities filled with therapists. On quiet residential streets, brass plaques appeared outside brownstone homes. Inside, couches awaited patients willing to speak the unspeakable. It became normal to examine childhood, to trace adult behaviour to early injury. Psychoanalytic ideas found their way into films, television, and literature. The notion of working on oneself emerged, transforming introspection from eccentricity into responsibility. Yet even as psychoanalysis flourished, it began to fracture. Freud had always expected resistance from the outside world, but he had not foreseen the battles that would erupt among his own intellectual descendants. Some accused others of betraying the essence of analysis. Others claimed Freud himself had been too cautious, too narrow, too bound by his era's prejudices. In London, Melanie Klein argued that the unconscious formed long before Freud believed possible. Infants, she claimed, did not wait until childhood to wrestle with fear, envy, aggression, or longing. They entered the world already entangled in psychic conflict. Klein saw the nursery not as a place of innocence, but as a crucible. Freud's theories trembled. His disciples disagreed fiercely. It was as though Freud had raised children who now demanded to argue with their father. Across the Channel, Jacques Lacan staged an intellectual rebellion of his own. With a voice like a spell and a mind like a labyrinth, he reshaped Freud's theories around language. The unconscious, he argued, was structured not like a myth or a memory, but like a sentence, filled with symbols, gaps, and grammatical compulsions. Desire was not natural, it was linguistic. Identity was not firm, it was performative. Lacan did not overthrow Freud. He refracted him, as a prism refracts light, into spectrums Freud never imagined. Meanwhile, in the United States, ego psychology emerged. Analysts began focusing not on the hidden forces that drove people, but on the adaptability of the ego, the ways individuals negotiated between instinct and social demands. Psychoanalysis became a tool not merely for uncovering pain, but for strengthening identity. Some saw this as evolution. Others saw it as domestication. Yet even as theories multiplied, they all knelt at Freud's threshold. Every disagreement began with his name. Every revision gestured at his shadow. Freud had done something few thinkers achieve. He established not merely a doctrine, but a terrain. Others would map it differently, but it was his landscape they surveyed. While scholars debated Freud academically, artists absorbed him intuitively. Surrealists embraced dreams as portals through which the unconscious spoke. Paintings by Salvador Dalí dripped with Freudian imagery. Melting clocks, ambiguous forms, bodies dissolving into desire. Filmmakers infused narratives with symbols and secrets. Writers explored characters whose motives contradicted their words. The modern novel changed forever. Theatre became Freudian as well. Characters no longer acted from simple goals. They acted from wounds. Their motivations were layered, murky, and contradictory. The stage became a psychic arena where truth was never what it appeared to be. Freud had turned the human being into a detective, searching for the meaning beneath behaviour. Perhaps the most surprising adoption of Freudian ideas occurred in politics. Freud himself never trusted mass movements. He feared the irrationality of the crowd, the erotic energy of fanaticism, the primitive urges hiding beneath banners and slogans. But others recognized that these insights were tools. Dangerous, yes, but powerful. If desire and fear guided human action, then those who understood desire and fear could guide humanity. Edward Bernays, Freud's nephew, transformed psychoanalysis into persuasion. He took Freud's warnings and repurposed them into strategies. Consumers became analysans, products became fantasies, advertising became therapy. A car was not a vehicle, but potency. A cigarette was not tobacco, but liberation. Politics became performance, choice became compulsion. Freud had wanted to help people understand themselves. Others learned to sell them illusions. Still, no matter how distorted Freud's work became, another side of his legacy persisted. One quieter, less sensational, more devout. In psychoanalytic offices across the world, therapists sat with patients and listened. Freud had insisted that speech itself was a pathway to the unconscious, that silence was not empty but saturated with meaning. These therapists did not search for theories. They searched for truths. They listened for the slip of the tongue, the tremor in a sentence, the memory that arrived uninvited. They waited for patients to discover that the mind is not a fortress, but a house with locked rooms. Some patients left analysis transformed. Others left angry, wounded by truths they did not want. Psychoanalysis was never a guarantee. It was an invitation. It asked for courage, the courage to look inward and not turn away. As the 20th century reached its midpoint, the scientific world began demanding evidence. Behaviorism rose, insisting that the mind should be studied through observable behavior, not invisible motives. Psychoanalysis seemed too nebulous, too dependent on words, interpretation, and metaphor. Critics proclaimed Freud obsolete. They celebrated his death with almost ecstatic zeal. Yet even as they denounced him, they borrowed his ideas without noticing. Freud was the ghost inside their logic. Then a new field emerged, neuroscience. Researchers peered inside the brain, expecting to disprove Freud once and for all. They discovered something unsettling. The brain did not behave like a rational machine. Decisions formed before consciousness caught up. Memory was fragmented, reconstructed, reshaped by emotion. People acted against self-interest, clung to illusions, and repeated destructive patterns. The unconscious had a neural pulse. Freud was not entirely accurate. He was something more dangerous, directionally correct. His theories were not biological facts, but metaphors that pointed toward truths science would later confirm. He had sensed the terrain long before technology could map it. As decades passed, Freud remained both revered and ridiculed. The world no longer needed to believe him to think like him. Children learned that feelings mattered. Adult struggles were traced backwards into childhood landscapes. People apologized for projecting, spoke of defense mechanisms, joked about Freudian slips. Psychoanalysis had invaded culture not as doctrine, but as instinct. Freud once predicted that psychoanalysis would face resistance until the end of time, because it revealed something the mind does not want to know. That reason is not the ruler of the psyche, but its servant. He understood that people would fight to preserve illusions. The unconscious was not something to celebrate, it was something to survive. And yet, even as the world resisted Freud, it could not rid itself of him. To deny Freud was to speak his language, to escape him was to prove his point. The analyst had become the analyst of civilization. There is a particular kind of legacy that belongs only to a few figures in history. Those who alter not what we think, but what it is possible to think. Freud belongs to this lineage. He did not tell humanity what to believe. He taught humanity how to suspect belief. He made doubt introspective. He made dreams articulate. He made desire audible. Even now, long after the man himself has turned to ash, we remain inside the story he began. The questions Freud raised do not sleep. They do not conclude. They do not politely step aside for new theories. They linger because they are stitched into human nature. Why do we fear what we long for? Why do we sabotage what we cherish? Why does the past refuse to stay in the past? Freud did not answer these questions. He made them unavoidable. And the world has been wrestling with them ever since. Part 10. The world he left behind. There are thinkers whose ideas remain confined to their age, preserved like artifacts in a museum, studied, admired, and finally forgotten. Then there are those whose work escapes its origins, mutating into something larger, something woven into the fabric of daily existence. Freud belonged to the second category, not because he willed it, but because he articulated forces far older than himself. To speak of Freud is not merely to recount his biography, it is to recognize that the world after him became a different world entirely. The decades following Freud's death revealed something peculiar. His theories did not fossilize, they ripened, they evolved, they infiltrated places no one expected. The unconscious, once a concept reserved for medical discourse, became a cultural constant. People no longer assumed that behavior reflected intention. They learned to suspect motivation, to search behind the curtain of consciousness, to doubt the sincerity of the self. In the houses of ordinary families, a subtle shift occurred. Parents hesitated before disciplining a child, wondering not what the child had done, but what it meant. A nightmare was no longer a senseless disturbance. It was a message. A phobia was not a quirk. It was a clue. People began to ask questions that did not exist before Freud. What happened in childhood that never left? What is the meaning of this fear? Why am I drawn to what hurts me? It was as though Freud had made mystery itself respectable. His concepts shaped literature in ways that changed storytelling forever. Characters prior to Freud acted from external necessity: honour, fate, duty, revenge. Characters after Freud acted from wounds. Their choices were riddles. Their words were masks. Their desires were coded messages. Novels became case histories. Plays became elaborate sessions of confession and conflict. Audiences learned to ask not what happened on stage, but why. Film absorbed Freud with remarkable intensity. Directors moved the camera not to record events, but to capture psychological states. The dream sequence, once an indulgent interruption, became a cinematic tool. A character's glance suggested guilt. A cut in lighting hinted at memory. Audiences left the theatre, analysing, interpreting, suspecting. Freud had taught humanity that life was not merely lived, it was deciphered. Perhaps the most astonishing adoption of Freud's work emerged in places where he would have felt the greatest unease: corporate offices, marketing firms, and the halls of government. His nephew Edward Bernays weaponized Freud's insights. Bernays saw something Freud himself never embraced: that if the unconscious shapes desire, then shaping desire shapes the world. Advertising stopped merely presenting products. It began crafting identities. The question was no longer, what do you need, but who are you? Desire transformed into industry. The unconscious became profitable. Meanwhile, Freud's influence seeped into the courtroom. Defense attorneys invoked childhood trauma to mitigate crimes. Juries learned to consider repressed memories. Psychologists testified. The legal system, once beholden to rational models of choice, now wrestled with hidden motives, emotional injuries, and impulses the conscious mind could not tame. A crime became a symptom. A motive became a labyrinth. Education changed as well. Children were no longer vessels to be filled with knowledge. They were psyches in development, delicate, malleable, burdened with invisible histories. Teachers studied motivation, attachment, emotional development. Schools hired counsellors. Parents became detectives of their children's minds, interpreting drawings, nightmares, tantrums. Freud did not create childhood. He revealed its weight. And yet, for all this influence, Freud remained a paradox. He was celebrated and denounced, revered and mocked, invoked and dismissed. The more ingrained his ideas became, the more fiercely some resisted them. Critics accused psychoanalysis of pseudoscience, of cultural imperialism, of overemphasizing sexuality, of reducing humanity to pathology. But criticism did not weaken Freud's hold, it strengthened it. To argue against Freud was to demonstrate that his questions had become inescapable. As the 20th century advanced, new movements emerged to challenge him. Cognitive. Psychology demanded measurable evidence. Behaviorism dismissed the unconscious as fiction. Neuroscience promised to replace metaphor with mechanism. Yet each attempt exposed something unanticipated. The mind was not as transparent as these theories claimed. Consciousness was still only the surface. Emotion still preceded logic. The brain still formed memories like stories, not files. Freud's theories were not scientific in the strict sense. They were mythological diagnostics, narratives interpreting forces too vast for data alone. Science confirmed pieces of Freud, but culture confirmed the whole. Modern identity now exists in a space Freud helped design. People believe their past shapes their present. They recognize that childhood lingers. They accept that desire complicates ethics. They sense that truth, especially personal truth, is layered. Even those who reject Freud speak like him. They have internalized the arch of suspicion he introduced. Every apology hides something. Every argument has a subtext. Every romance revives a memory. Freud turned communication into excavation. He also transformed selfhood. Before Freud, identity was something inherited, defined by family, class, religion. After Freud, identity became a project. People sought themselves, revised themselves, questioned themselves. Therapy became pilgrimage. Autobiography became ritual. Self-knowledge became virtue. But Freud's deepest legacy lies not in therapy or theory, but in the shift he imposed upon human expectation. He taught humanity that beneath reason lies something older. He insisted that instinct is not childish but permanent. He revealed that people do not resist truth because they lack facts, but because truth threatens desire. He exposed that society rests on repression, and that repression is the price we pay for civilization. This insight reshaped how nations understood themselves. Political leaders, once convinced that policy and power alone governed societies, realized that emotion shaped entire populations. Fear, envy, resentment, humiliation. These were forces stronger than law. Freud had warned about the monstrous potential of collective psychology. The 20th century proved him right. His analysis of religion likewise lived on. Freud claimed that gods were projections of human longing and terror, father figures magnified into eternity. While many rejected this explanation, it changed the way religious belief was studied. Faith was no longer only sacred, it became psychological. Motives mattered. Rituals carried echoes of childhood. Even believers began asking questions Freud had posed. At the same time, Freud's own blindnesses became part of his legacy. His theories of gender reflected the prejudices of his era. His interpretations of women were flawed, sometimes breathtakingly so. Yet feminist theorists did not discard Freud. They deconstructed him. They found in his errors not dishonesty, but transparency. The psyche of an age laid bare. Freud had revealed not the truth of womanhood, but the truth of patriarchal imagination. This capacity to be both wrong and indispensable is rare. It belongs to figures whose ideas transform so deeply that history becomes impossible to tell without them. Eventually, Freud became less a person and more a framework. He turned selfhood into a terrain and gave humanity a shovel. He did not promise enlightenment. He promised depth. He urged the world to confront its contradictions, to recognize that people do not merely think, they dream, repress, disguise, and repeat. In doing so, he changed the meaning of truth. No longer was truth something found only in reason. Truth could hide in dreams, in fear, in longing, in silence. A forgotten moment in a nursery might govern a lifetime. A single shame could shape a destiny. Freud made the invisible consequential. The irony is that while Freud forced the world to question itself, he never offered comfort. Psychoanalysis was not salvation, it was confrontation. Freud did not promise happiness. He promised honesty, and honesty is rarely gentle. But perhaps Freud understood something the modern world has yet to grasp, that to know oneself is perilous, but to remain unknown to oneself is fatal. The unconscious will not sleep simply because we ignore it. What is denied returns. What is repressed erupts. What is hidden shapes the visible. Freud did not invent the shadow. He named it. And once named, it could no longer govern unseen. Humanity continues to grapple with Freud's revelations, not because his theories are flawless, but because they describe a landscape we inhabit, whether we acknowledge it or not. The unconscious persists, desire persists, fear persists, identity persists, and the self, far from stable, sways like a flame. Freud did not extinguish that flame. He showed us where to look when it flickers. Part 11. The dream that outlived its dreamer. There comes a moment in every long journey when the traveller realises that the road ahead has grown short, not because there is no more to see, but because the landscape has been crossed, understood, and internalised. So it is with the story of Sigmund Freud. We have traced his life from the small town in Moravia to the glittering salons of Vienna, through ruptures, revolutions, exile, and pain. We have walked alongside him in the shadows of the unconscious, where memory whispers and desire hides its face. We have watched his thought ignite both admiration and outrage, reshape entire disciplines, fracture old certainties, and give language to forces no one had dared name. And now, as night folds itself gently around us, we arrive at the last turn in the path, not where Freud ends, but where we must decide what his journey means. For the truth is this: Freud's legacy was never meant to be entombed in museums or confined to academic journals. It was meant to haunt the ordinary, to linger in conversations, to follow us into dreams, to press itself against our choices, our fears, our loves, our failures. Freud believed the mind was not made of facts, but of forces. He believed humanity would never be at peace until it faced what it fled. He believed the unconscious was not a theory. It was a fact of existence, waiting for recognition. And so his death was not a conclusion. It was a beginning. Only when Freud himself vanished did his ideas begin to breathe fully. Freed from the weight of their creator, they roamed more widely than he ever had, transforming lives he never knew, shaping debates he never heard, stirring the minds of people who would never read a page of his work. The unconscious became common language. Childhood became biography. Identity became excavation. And reality itself, once a proud construction of reason, became porous and trembling, like a dream that knows it is a dream. But what does it mean now to live in a world after Freud? For we do not merely read his ideas, we inhabit them. In the quiet hours of the night, when sleep will not come, a person stares at the ceiling and asks, "Why did I say that? Why did I hurt the one I love? Why does this memory refuse to leave?" These questions, once private torments, Freud turned into tools. He taught us that distress has structure, that guilt has a past, that desire has a language, that dreams are not noise but narrative. He did not solve suffering. He dignified it. Freud's greatest contribution was not the id, nor the ego, nor the superego, nor even the talking cure. It was permission. Permission to take oneself seriously, to assume that behaviour has reasons even when those reasons are hidden, to suspect that the mind is wider than consciousness, deeper than intention, older than memory. Freud gave humanity a mirror, then reminded it that mirrors are never empty. Yet Freud's mirror reflected more than individuals. It reflected civilization itself. He warned that progress does not tame human nature. it redirects it. He believed that repression was the price of social harmony, and that beneath every monument lay bones. Civilization, he said, is built not only on law and order, but on instinct denied, hunger thwarted, longing punished. Those who read Civilization and its discontents for the first time often feel unsettled, as though someone has peeled back a layer of comfort they did not realize they needed. Freud did not write to soothe. He wrote to expose. And still, even after the wars that followed proved him right, the world could not bear his diagnosis. People wanted explanation, not implication. They wanted solutions, not mirrors. Freud offered neither. He did not pretend humanity could ever be free of conflict. He insisted that conflict was what made us human. This perhaps is why Freud remained so alive. He speaks not to eras, but to conditions. Conditions that persist as long as there are people who dream, who desire, who fear, who fail, who remember. Every generation thinks itself modern, rational, enlightened. Every generation discovers, sooner or later, that the mind does not obey calendars. Our unconscious remains ancient. We can measure the brain now. We can see neural pathways flicker like constellations. We can trace memories in proteins, watch emotions surge in real time, map the mind as though it were territory. And yet, every scientific advance leads back to a truth Freud intuited. Consciousness is not in charge. We are steered by forces we do not command, by scripts we did not write, by wounds we did not choose. Freud predicted resistance, and resistance arrived. But resistance confirms what it denies. Those who dismiss psychoanalysis still speak as Freud taught them, with suspicion, with ambivalence, with awareness of the unseen. But Freud's legacy is not only intellectual, it is emotional. He gave voice to the private battles people wage within themselves. He removed shame from suffering. He insisted that what hurts us also reveals us. He turned the therapist's office into a sanctuary where stories previously locked away could emerge, tremble, and be heard. He did not cure humanity, but he humanized its pain. Still, it would be dishonest to ignore his failures. Freud's theories reflect the blind spots of his era, his misunderstandings of women, his neglect of trauma beyond childhood sexuality, his insistence on universals that ignored culture. Some ideas were flawed, others were misguided. Yet even these failures serve a purpose. They reveal not Freud's weakness, but the limits of any single thinker confronting the vastness of the human psyche. Freud did not finish psychology. He began it, and that may be the most unsettling thing of all. To begin something so enormous that no one can complete it is to condemn oneself to eternal relevance. Freud did not want apostles. He wanted wrestlers, people willing to confront the unconscious, challenge their illusions, question themselves, and never settle for easy answers. He believed analysis was not a method but a stance, a way of living that refused to accept simple explanations. He believed the world would always try to sleep. He believed the mind would always resist awakening. The unconscious, he said, always wages war against knowledge. But knowledge, once awakened, does not sleep again. This is why Freud's ideas endure. Not because they are perfect, but because they are provocative. Not because they are definitive, but because they are generative. Freud put cracks in the surface of certainty, and through those cracks, light poured in. Every new theory about the mind, every book, every lecture, every treatment, every debate must contend with the path Freud carved. Whether they walk beside him or try to walk past him, they walk where he walked. What, then, does it mean to close the story of Freud? Perhaps nothing closes? Perhaps stories like his do not end. They dissolve into consciousness, into language, into perception. They become the air of thought. Yet every narrative needs a resting place, and Freud's must be found not in his writings, nor in the controversies that followed, but in the quiet image of an elderly man standing in his London garden, breath shallow, cane in hand, watching the smoke from his cigar curl upward into the night. Behind that smoke lies Vienna, and behind Vienna lies a boy who once wondered why people lie to themselves. Freud followed that question through a lifetime. When he died, the question lived on, restless, whispering through history. So here we stand, not at an answer, but at an inheritance. Freud may have believed that dreams conceal, but his legacy reveals. What it reveals is not a single truth, but an invitation, a summons to self-knowledge, difficult and unsettling, but necessary. To look inward is perilous, but to refuse is disaster. We dream, we desire, we repeat, we fear, we repress, we confess. We are not simple, we are never finished. Freud saw this and did not flinch. He gave the world permission to face what it would rather avoid. And now, as this journey reaches its conclusion, one truth remains. Freud did not teach us what to think. He taught us that thinking begins where certainty ends, and the rest, the dreams, the doubts, the desires, belongs to us.